Good evening. Thank you for joining us for a conversation with author Judy Batalion and Hebrew University alumna and freelance journalist Diane Hess. I'm Rachel Sigmund, the Philadelphia director for the American Friends of the Hebrew University, and we're delighted to bring you this program tonight. We're thrilled to have so many people joining us from all over the U.S. and even some from Canada. The Hebrew University was founded over 100 years ago by Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, and others to educate Israel's best and brightest students. Hebrew University faculty have been awarded 8 Nobel Prizes and continue to lead the way in innovation and research across a multitude of disciplines. American Friends was established to connect Americans to the brilliant minds at the Hebrew University. We raise awareness of the university and the necessary support for students and faculty. Before I turn the program over to our guest speakers, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Diane, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Rachel, for your wonderful introduction and for all you do. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Judy Batalion to this evening's American Friends of the Hebrew University program. Judy is the author of The Light of Days, the untold story of women resistance fighters in Hitler's ghettos. Born and raised in Montreal, Judy grew up speaking English, French, Yiddish, and Hebrew. She's worked as a curator, researcher, editor, and comedian. She has written for various publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Vogue, and the Jerusalem Post. Her first book, White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between, is being developed into a TV series by Warner Brothers. Judy lives with her husband, John Lightman, an American Friends of the Hebrew University board member, and 3 children in New York City. Over a decade ago, Judy stumbled upon a written account of women resistance fighters in the Nazi ghettos. Although she is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, grew up in a community of survivors, and earned a doctorate in women's history, neither she nor anyone for that matter had ever heard these true accounts of women fighters in Hitler's ghettos before. Today, The Light of Days is on the New York Times bestseller list and has been optioned for a major motion picture by Steven Spielberg. Judy Batalion, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You were working as a stand-up comedian in London in 2007 when you came upon a tattered book written in Yiddish about women resistance fighters in the Nazi ghettos. Can you please talk about how you unearthed this hidden literary gem and why you decided to write The Light of Days?
Of course. So I should begin by saying that this entire project happened by accident. It started 14 years ago, so it's been quite an odyssey, I've been calling it. I was living in London. I was doing performance work as a comedian, and I was also working in the art world. And I started really thinking a lot about my Jewish identity, what it meant to me. I myself, as you said, am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I was thinking a lot about what I call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma passes through generations. And in my own life, I was very interested in danger. I felt that I was thinking about how my Holocaust heritage was shaping how I perceived and reacted to danger. And I decided to write about that for the stage. It was supposed to be a performance. I wanted to write about a strong Jewish woman who had confronted danger. And the first woman to come to mind was Hannah Senesh. I don't know, for those who haven't heard of her, Hannah Senesh, someone, by the way, who I studied in 5th grade. Hannah Senesh was a Hungarian Jew. She was young, about 20 years old, and she moved to what was then Palestine before in the 30s, before World War II. But during the war, she decided she wanted to fight back. She joined the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper, and she volunteered to go back to Nazi-occupied Europe. I had always studied Hannah Senesh. I'd always heard of her as a symbol of courage. She was a hero. But back in 2007, when I was living in London, I didn't want to know about Hannah Senesh, the hero. I wanted to know about Hannah Senesh, the person. Like, who does that? Who goes back who chooses to go back to fight the Nazis? What is the personality behind that? What is the psychology behind that? I was looking for a nuanced biography of Hannah Senesh. So I went to the British Library and I looked up Hannah Senesh in the catalog. There were not very many books about her, but I ordered whatever they had. And one of the books in the stack came back to me, and it was quite unusual. It was in a blue fabric cover with gold lettering, and it was an old book. And it was also in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. Even more unusual than the book, I always say, is the fact that I speak Yiddish. So I started flipping through the book. I was looking for Hannah Senesh. Maybe it had some interesting information about her. But I couldn't find her. Hannah Senesh was only in the last 10 pages. In front of her, there were 150, 160 pages of other young Jewish women who had fought the Nazis and who had fought them from within and without the ghettos. There were names and snippets of biographies and snippets of testimony and photographs and chapter titles like Weapons, Ammunition, Partisan Battle. It was like nothing I'd ever read or heard of. It was like no other Holocaust narrative I'd ever come across, both in content and in tone. And I knew this was remarkable, and it was something I basically haven't let go since.
I want to go back to your family history just for a moment, because you've explained that your grandmother told you her survival story, your grandparents' story on a regular basis after school as she cared for you. Could you talk about the influence of your family's history on the writing of this book?
I mean, this book is not about my family. The book is, I'm not related to any of these figures, though it sort of began to feel like I was. I almost felt like I was, for some of them, the granddaughters they never had because they didn't survive. But my family story, my family did survive the Holocaust. My grandparents were married by the time the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, and together they escaped occupied Poland. They went east, and it was a very difficult journey. And I never got the full story together. It was always in snippets, which I found out is actually common. But my grandmother would tell me bits of the story. There was, they were hiding in a truck with fruit, and they were hiding in a convent, and they were swimming across a river, and there was a Nazi who turned a blind eye, and they made it across the Russian border. My grandfather's brother was actually killed on the way. My grandfather has a scar. He had a scar his whole life on his neck where the bullet grazed him and hit his brother. And they were like most of the Polish Jews who survived, they were survived by going to Russia. They were put in work camps in Siberia, which they never talked about. That is another underreported story. That's for my next book. So, I also have a lot of mysteries and a lot of unanswered questions in my own family survival story. So perhaps that's partially why I was so keen to find out more about these women too.
The research effort that went into The Light of Days is nothing short of spectacular. It's truly a marvelous accomplishment. Could you describe how you wove together individual stories of World War II heroines to create such a seamless narrative?
I'm not sure I can. I'm not sure. That was a very challenging part of the project, I think. So let me answer it this way. When I set out to write the history, the story of Jewish women in the resistance in Poland, it's not the case that I had to really create a chronology. sometimes, and I've done this in other projects, I've written about missing women's histories, but there has been a sort of male history or a standard history. And I've then said, wait, the women are missing. But in this case, there wasn't even a standard history of Jewish resistance in Poland. There were amazing sources and books that talked about particular ghettos, particular people, particular places or revolts, but there was no general history. And so I'm telling you this because what I had to do to create this book, I was making a history out of personal stories. So I read dozens and dozens and dozens of testimonies in many languages, and I did have some help with that. And then I had to make a panoramic history out of this. So the first 6 months of my writing process was almost like a second grade project. I was making a timeline of what happened when from these different personal accounts. And that's what helped me to understand the overall story. And this answers your question because when I came to structure the story, it was really based on this timeline. So it is chronological. And I understood, well, this is where she comes into the story. Oh, this is where Vilna comes in. Oh, they did that in 42. Wait, that was in 43. That was in 42. So creating that chronology was a very foundational part of my storytelling. Does that answer the question at all?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. It gives a sense of just how complex the effort was and how involved, although I'm not sure you could fully describe in a quick answer just how complex it actually was. But many of the women you write about you describe as are courier girls. Who were the courier girls? Could you explain the tasks that they performed and the feats accomplished by women ghetto fighters?
Okay, so I try to include in my work a broad range of women's roles in the resistance in Poland, in the organized resistance, and these range from women who were running soup kitchens, underground schools, helping orphans, doing child rescue, printing secret bulletins, which they then transported by braiding them in their hair, and to all the way to women who were blowing up Nazi trains, women who were shooting Nazis, who were assassins, who were fighters in ghetto uprisings, flinging Molotov cocktails and throwing explosives at Nazi tanks. Many of the women I write about were, as you say, courier girls. In Hebrew, the Hebrew term's a bit better. They were called keshariot, or connectors. And what these young Jewish women did was they worked outside the ghetto. They slipped in and out of ghettos doing underground work. And in order to do that, they performed as Christian girls, as Catholic girls. And they would leave the ghettos in order to both connect communities, bring information. In the ghettos, Jews were not allowed to have radios. They were not allowed to have newspapers. It was often young Jewish women who were bringing the news, even bringing the news of the Nazi genocide, of what was going on. These women, when the undergrounds in the ghettos started to become militias in late 41, 1942, it was these young Jewish women who had been now used to leaving the ghettos and had techniques for it. They became the main people who were arming the undergrounds. They would slip out of ghettos and meet with arms dealers, meet with people from the Polish resistance, buy guns, explosives, ammunition, and bring them back into the ghetto. They also, especially after many of the ghettos were razed, they did rescue work. And they took Jews from ghettos, from slave labor camps, and from even and they tried to find them safe hiding spots, either in cities or in the forests.
Renya Kukielka is the central character of the book. She's ahead of her times. She's fashionable, bold, charismatic, dramatic. She disguises her Jewish identity. She's courageous. Could you give us a sense of her and a glimpse into her story?
Renya is the central character. She was always my central character, and she in the original Yiddish book, which turns out was a collection of snippets, excerpts, and bits from other testimonies, memoirs, newspapers of the time. She had the longest section in the middle, and it was written. It was so dramatic. It was written with narrative and detail and movement. This is a story of a woman who literally jumps off trains. And I was very drawn to her, even with wit, her tone, as a writer, I felt a connection to her. And she was also, she felt very relatable, very modern to me. She wasn't overly political. She didn't use rhetoric, or she sounded very contemporary. So she was always going to be my central character. I can tell you a bit about her if I haven't already overtalked it. She was 15 when the war began. She had been a top student. She studied to become a stenographer. She had started working in the town's court. But it was 1939. She was already defiant in the ghetto. She used to escape. She used to leave the ghetto in order to trade family heirlooms for food to help feed her family. She helped many other Jews in the ghettos. When she knew that she was going to be killed, she escaped from the ghetto. She fled through forests. She pretended to be Christian. She was taking trains through the country. Once she was recognized on a train, someone from the town she was from knew she was Jewish, and she just picked up her valise, walked to the back of the train, and jumped right off. She got a job working as a housemaid for a half German family, but she really missed her sister. And she had an older sister who she really idolized. And she ended up finding a way to connect with her sister in another town. And her sister arranged for a smuggler to come bring her to this town of Bejin, where her sister was part of the underground. And the underground in Bejin at the time was trying to arm and get ready for an uprising. But all their courier girls, who had been bringing them information and weapons, they'd all been killed. There was nothing coming in. And so they needed someone who looked good, as they called it, which meant she looked Polish, not Jewish, to go do these missions. And they asked her, and she immediately said, yes, of course I will go. And she began doing missions back and forth between Bejin and Warsaw, bringing information, connecting with different resistance factions, transporting many fake IDs and fake travel papers, money, trying to arrange for buses to take Jews out of the ghetto, and then transporting weapons. She went to Warsaw Cemetery, met with weapons dealers, bought guns, taped them to her torso, was getting on trains back and forth, flirting, pretending to be an innocent, carefree Catholic girl out for the day, maybe admitting to smuggling a few potatoes when really there were explosives in her bag. She also helped rescue some Jews, taking them from the ghetto to safe spots and to hiding places. I could go on, but you need to buy the book. So I can't tell you everything. Her story only gets better from there.
Renya and the other women knew the odds were against them. They had to. Where did they get the courage? Did they fear? How did they hold it together?
That's a great question. And I have a few answers to that. I think that, when you read the diaries from the time or close to the time, they don't talk about fear. The tone is not one of fear. It is one of fury and passion and deep desire for both vengeance and for justice, and to correct what is wrong and this brutality in the world. Fear isn't the emotion that comes up. I think that some of it was their circumstance. I think some of it was, many of these women were very, like Renya, instinct driven. They were doers. They trusted their gut and went for it. And I think partially that's why I'm so attracted to them, because I'm not like that. And I'm so sort of bowled over by people who can act in that way. I think a lot of it, though, also has to do with the fact that before the war, many of these women were parts of the youth movements. And youth movements were, Polish Jewry was really organized into youth movements. 100,000 young Polish Jews were part of these youth movements, they were like the Scouts, but more so. They were intellectual, social, emotional, spiritual training grounds. They were value driven. The movements that I write about were all socialist and secular. Some were Zionists, some were not. But they all believed so much. They were trained in this passion for Jewish pride, pride in your history, pride in your people. They were socialists. They believed in equality, egalitarianism, collectivism, collaboration. They often left their family homes, this is before the war, to move into kibbutzim in Poland together. So they had lived together. They trusted each other. They had very strong bonds, and I think all that coupled with they also were very into emotional awareness. I read a lot about them, how they studied psychoanalysis, and they had reading groups in psychology, and they talked about their strengths and their weaknesses. They were very self-conscious, learning how to both collaborate and relate to people. And they literally learned how to act, how to think through problems, how to plot and act. And I think this training in these youth movements actually was really influential, and really they were primed to do this kind of work, even though it was completely different to what, these were movements of peace, and they became movements of guerrilla war. But the bonds and the value systems that these women were trained with and that they made, I really think helped them do this work.
You ponder the question of fight versus flight throughout the pages of your book as your characters confront the question themselves. Some of them could have left. Frumka Plotnica is given the opportunity to leave Poland, but decides to stay. And another character, Zivia Lubetkin, also chooses to fight. Why would these women have made that decision, knowing there might have been a path to safety?
So not only were they offered chances to leave, Frumka and Zivia both left. When the Nazis conquered Poland in 1939, both of these women fled east, like my grandparents had fled. And both of them were in areas that, at least at the time being, were safe. They had left, they had escaped. But for both of them, they couldn't sit with that. They felt this tremendous responsibility for their people, for the Jewish community. They smuggled themselves. So Frumka was the first one. She smuggled herself back into Nazi occupied Poland. And through the war, she was on several occasions given papers that maybe would have helped her get out of the country. She never took them. She was a leader in the youth movements before the war, both of them were, and they continued to feel a real sense of duty to their community.
There are times in the book when you invoke the thoughts and feelings of the characters. Were there any difficult authorial decisions in writing the story and dealing with historical discrepancies that arose as you pulled it all together?
That's a really good question. Yeah, it certainly was something I thought about all the time. Um, I, I found that, you know, first of all, some of the writing did have a lot of emotion in it, and it was psychological, especially some of the diaries from the war. There's one diary that was written in a prison in Krakow on toilet paper, and written by Gusta Davidson. She was one of the leaders of the Krakow Underground, and it is so filled with psychological insight. She was a writer, and it's beautifully written and beautifully done. So sometimes I didn't need to make any kind of leaps in that way. I really tried to write in a very, what we would call a close third person, where I stayed very close to these women's testimonies. There were some things that had to be filled out for just for the story to make sense. And there were things that I'm working with memoirs. These are not cold data. So of course there were elements of, there were discrepancies, even in one person's, their own telling. What they said on page 30 and page 85 wasn't always exactly in line. And certainly if people who left multiple testimonies over the years, their own stories changed with time, their memories altered, as it does for all of us. So I really try to read as many accounts of the same event as possible. And despite all the discrepancies, what was most exciting as a historian is that you see that that event in 1942, oh, she talked about it. Oh, she also talked about it. Oh, he also talked about it. So even though they had slightly different takes on it, they were all talking about that same day. And that was actually very exciting for me. So I try to, research whatever historians had also written around the subject and the issue, and incorporate that with these different takes on the event in order to create the fullest picture that I could. And also there was some judgment on my part if I thought something was more likely to be accurate. And that was my own call on it. But I do have about 70 pages of endnotes at the end of the book. And a lot of that is me rambling on. You do not need to read the endnotes, so don't panic. But a lot of that is me discussing why I chose the versions I did. And I do present what some other versions of the story are. So yes, I was very conscious of this.
Why were women so important and impactful in resistance efforts against the Nazis, perhaps more so than men, even in combat?
So I don't know that they were more impactful, but they had a different type of impact and were able to do a different type of work. And this is because they were women. And there are a few reasons. So first of all, as I was saying, for many of these women, it was easier for women to do work on the outside, on the Aryan side, outside the ghetto. It was easier for women to pass as being Christian. And there are a few reasons for this. One is women were not circumcised. So there's no physical marker of their Jewishness on their body. For men, there was. And for men, if a man was presumed to be Jewish or if he was suspected of it, he was literally at gunpoint told to drop his pants. Women did not have that threat. Women also, in the 30s, these women went to school. Education was mandatory in Poland for boys and girls up to 8th grade. But Jewish families often sent their sons to Jewish schools, but they sent their daughters to Polish public schools. And in these schools, women learned, they had a lot of Christian friends. They were around non-Jews all the time. They became aware of habits and of even of Catholic prayer and certainly of Catholic gesture. And every time I talk about this, I notice myself on the Zoom gesturing like this. This was considered, gesticulating was very Jewish. And one woman writes about how when she went to pass, she had to wear a muff to hold her hands together so that she wouldn't do it. But women were aware of this, and they also were taught to speak Polish. They always talk about this like a Pole, not with the creaky Yiddish accent. So even when men in the underground had to leave the ghettos, they almost always went with a woman for various reasons, but one of them was the woman always talked. She bought the train tickets. She would ask if they needed directions, they needed to go in somewhere. She did all the talking because she had the more assimilated Polish. And then, of course, women were not suspected. Women are not only trained to listen to others' cues, to be aware of what others are thinking, to be aware of our surrounds, to be coy, to be flirtatious. In Nazi culture especially, it was very classically sexist, and it simply wasn't. Women weren't suspected. They were they had the skills to be these undercover spies who were never suspected. In one of the stories, one of the resistance fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto, Masha Futermilk, tells a story that as she's in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, she's literally, her hands are shaking. She's so nervous. She's so excited. She is lighting this match to light the explosive to throw at the Nazis. And she hears them screaming from below, "Eine Frau kommt, eine Frau kommt." Like, what they're shocked about is that it's a woman. They were not suspected. And so for all these reasons, they were able to do underground and undercover work in a way that men weren't.
Your sense of humor is a hallmark of your personality. Where does it come from? And has humor played a role in helping people deal with the trauma of the Holocaust?
I didn't know we're doing a psychoanalysis session here. Where does my sense of humor come from? I don't know. I want to say my dad. He's really funny. I think he always trained me to look at life in a slightly skewed perspective from a very young age. Has humor helped you deal with the Holocaust? Is that what you're asking? Sort of after?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering if there's nothing humorous about it, obviously, but just the ways in which people deal with trauma over time and the ways that personalities evolve, and how perhaps like your personality is impacted by your family story.
Well, I have many answers to this, which will be our second Zoom conversation next week on humor and the Holocaust, which is one of my favorite subjects and something I've done a lot of research and reading on, even though it's not in this book. There was a chapter, but they made me take it out. It was too long. First of all, my grandmother, my grandmother literally she was obsessed with Three's Company. I mean, John Ritter, slapstick comedy. This was, and it wasn't by accident. She would tell me every day. I mean, when she was telling me these stories about her family, we'd be watching sitcoms the whole time. And she would say, "Judy, you need to laugh. You need to laugh. We need to laugh. Laughter is what keeps us alive." So, I mean, has humor helped? I mean, humor enables us to feel, and by the way, there was humor in the Holocaust. Again, I have to take that chapter out, but there was, humor was a major coping mechanism. Always. There were whole books of Jewish humor in the Holocaust. They were collected jokes. There were, so many jokes about Hitler. Humor is a weapon for people that don't have weapons. Humor brings people together. Humor creates solidarity. You have a common enemy. Humor really, it shows a distance from the subject. There's a self-consciousness. You feel like some capacity of control. If you look at something in a humorous way, you are stepping back. There is some way to see it with distance. And humor and laughter, I think, were coping mechanisms through the Holocaust and for survivors after.
You talked about the influence of the Polish youth movements on the resistance. And I wanted to ask you how much collaboration there was between the youth movements. Was there a lot of coordination that took place, despite the fact that some of them had different ideologies?
It depends. In some ghettos, in some undergrounds, there was quite easy collaboration between these different youth movements. These youth movements fought with each other before the war. They didn't get along. They had different politics and philosophies, and these fights continued through the war, and they continue even today. Even in their archives and libraries, they still each have their own archive of the Holocaust. So they are coming from different political places and different values. In a big project in a place like Warsaw, a big part of the underground, of developing the underground, was getting the different factions to align. And this was within the Jewish community and with the Polish resistance as well. By the way, there were two different main Polish resistance bodies. And then there were different resistance bodies in the Lithuanian territories and in the Russian ones. There were many different factions of underground. And this is another Zoom session we could do on all the resistances that were working in Poland at the time. There was really complicated. There were moments where they coalesced and were able to work together. And what you saw in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was a number of groups come together. And so you had a kind of mass and was able to have this bigger uprising moment. And then there were times where they didn't get along at all. They couldn't agree on anything. They didn't trust each other. They each wanted their own leaders to be the leaders. They even shot at each other. They really didn't like each other. So sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't.
I want to go back to Renya for a moment. She disguises her Jewish identity and is imprisoned as a Christian Pole, manages to escape and immigrate to Israel, then Palestine, in 1944. She leaves Poland a fugitive, wanted by the Gestapo, and arrives in Haifa at the age of 19. What was her life like in Israel, and how did some of the other survivors in your book adapt to life after the war?
All right, well, spoiler alert, she survives. So there we go. I should say that the last section of the book entirely takes place after the war. I was very interested in this question. As you know, I started with the question of how trauma passes through generations. I was so interested in understanding how these women continued to survive, how they overcame their experiences, and also how they, as fighters and as part of an organized defiance movement, did that affect their experience after the war? How was that different, perhaps? Renya, and each woman is very different and has a very different kind of experience. These are very different people. Renya's story, she writes her experiences down. This is what I'm drawing from. This is what was in that original Yiddish book in 1944 or 45. It's published, she writes in Polish, and it's published in Hebrew in 1945. And it's actually a well-received book. It was even translated into English in 1947 here and published in New York. But then for her, that was, in many ways, the writing was her therapy. It was cathartic, and it was her way of putting her story behind her. She was very young. She had her whole life ahead of her. She had nothing, no home, no nationality. At that time, she didn't know if she had any family. And she needed to move on. This desire to start fresh, which for many refugees is very real. They're in a new country, they're learning new languages, new customs. The world they knew doesn't exist anymore. And for her, she really needed to start fresh and put the story behind her. And from what I understand, she led a life of great joy, filled with, arts and fashion and travel, and family.
In 2018, before the publication of your book, a few years before the publication of your book, you traveled to Israel to meet with Renya's family. What was that like? How have they since then received your book? And also, what has the response been more generally in Israel?
Well, it was very exciting for me to meet. I met about 20 families. It was very exciting for me, but it was also very nerve-wracking for me. I mean, I had lived with these characters in my head for, 10 years. And meeting their families, whoa, they were real people. This really brought it home for me. I mean, they had children, they had homes, they had furniture, they had stuff. They were real people. I knew that, but meeting their families was frightening in that way. It was that collision of the world in my head with the world outside. And of course, I was very worried that the families wouldn't want me to write about their mothers or grandmothers, or that they wouldn't trust me. And I think overall, though, most people were very happy that I was pursuing this project, that I was telling these stories to a broader audience. In Renya's family, they knew about her past, they'd read her book, but they didn't even know about all the different testimonies she'd left. They didn't know her book had been published in the US in English. I was sending them information. She really hadn't talked that much to her children about it. So it was, I think, moving for both of us to sort of share this experience of this woman we all loved in very different ways. How have they received it? I don't know if the book just came out. I just sent copies to them, so I don't know if they've read it yet. I hope it will be well received. I did hear from some relatives in the US that have read the book, and they wrote to tell me that they were very honored by how in one case, their aunt, a great aunt, a grandmother was written about. So I was very moved by that and very relieved. The book is coming out in Israel, but it's been very delayed because of COVID. So it will come out in Hebrew, I believe, in 2022. So I'll let you know then. We'll have to do another Zoom, number 5.
Excellent, excellent. Keep me posted on your schedule. Can you talk about the film version of The Light of Days? Will you focus on Renya, and what are you learning? I know you're just in the beginning stages of transforming the book into a screenplay, but what are you learning in the process?
I mean, it's very early stages, so it is hard to talk about with any real insight. I don't have the distance. I think at the moment it's going to focus on Renya, but I don't want to say that because it might change. So I'm not sure. What I'm learning is that screenplay is much shorter than a book, and someone once told me if you look at a screenplay, the page is mostly white. There's very little. There's much less writing. So it's a project of paring down. It's a project, writing, I've done some work for screen before, and it's always interesting. You have to show, I as a memoirist, I write a lot of internal thoughts and internal ideas. You don't have that on a screen. Everything has to be shown. So that's always the challenge for me as a writer. How am I going to do this without sharing their heads?
What are you working on next? As if you're not busy enough with this book, do you have plans for other projects?
So I'm always working on like 100 different things, and certain things stick at the moment and certain things don't. I mean, right now I'm very busy with this project, and the screenplay and various translations and editions, and there's also a children's version. But I actually, the project I've been working on in my spare time has been much lighter. It's a novel, and it's also about women, and strong women, but it's a lighter project. I think I needed a little break from the heaviness of the subject matter for a bit. Then I'm sure I'll come back to it, because I can't seem to leave.
I want to end where I began, in recognition of the fact that these stories are seeing the light of day with the publication of your book for the first time. And we will take a few questions from tonight's participants. And as I'm scrolling through, I see that a number of our audience members are wondering, why were these stories forgotten? And I also want to ask, what is the difficulty of Holocaust remembrance? And what is the importance of remembering?
Okay, that's like a 10-part question with essay, and these are essay questions.
Take any part.
I mean, okay, so this question of why we didn't know this story, why this story wasn't more widely known, more popular before, this became the sub question of all my research. On the one hand, I wanted to know, what is the story? What happened in the Jewish resistance? What was women's role? What is the story? But at the same time, what happened to the story? Well, how could I not have known this? It's so dramatic and compelling, and there are hundreds of women involved, if not thousands. That's something we didn't talk about this evening. The scope of this is a large story. How did this go largely, not totally, but largely unreported over the years? And there are many reasons, believe it or not, which I do articulate in the book. Towards the end of the book, I get into this in more detail. But some of these reasons are political, and they have to do with how the Holocaust, our memory of the Holocaust, the narrative of the Holocaust has been shaped at times by political factors. Some of the reasons are zeitgeist. We've been interested in different elements of the Holocaust at different times. We've also been uncomfortable talking about different elements of the Holocaust at different times. So, in the 40s, there was interest in resistance fighters. In the 50s, some say there was some trauma fatigue and people didn't want to talk about it anymore. And then in the 60s, there was a renewed interest, but it was in Auschwitz and in what went on in these camps. And then in the 70s, that was a more bohemian moment. And the idea of violent or physical resistance was really downplayed. People were very uncomfortable with that. And the focus was much more on spiritual resistance, emotional resistance, what I would call like a softer resistance, resilience, that's the word. And so these factors change how we talk about the Holocaust. And then a lot of it also came down to the personal. Many of these women didn't tell their story, like Renya, or they told it and then they stopped telling it. Either they felt they weren't believed, many survivors, I read about this again and again, felt that they had been, there was this idea that the pure souls had perished, but if you survived, it's because you did something. You were a collaborator. These women had been accused of sleeping their way to safety. Many of them suffered from really a very pungent survivor's guilt. They felt that, the women I read about it, they felt that compared to their survivor peers who had been through Auschwitz, they hadn't had it that bad. They almost felt they didn't merit telling their story because they hadn't suffered as much as others. And then there was people like Renya who I think they just really needed to move on. They wanted to repopulate the Jews. They wanted to have families. They wanted to raise their children in happy, normal environments. And because of that, they didn't tell their stories until much later in their lives.
Okay. I'm going to turn to our audience questions now. And I think we have a few minutes for some final questions. And the first one is, was faith a part of the resistance? And what role did religion play? If it did play a role?
That's a good question. Because I focus on the youth movements that were largely secular, but they really believed in Jewish spirit and Jewish history and Jewish heritage. They were, what we might think of as cultural Jewish movements. That's the kind of Jewish faith that they had. I did not really come across discussions of religion, faith in that religious sense. It was more a faith in our people and in our history, and in our story. Some of the movements were a bit more observant than others, but it's not something I've read about a lot, at least not in the accounts that I was looking at.
Okay. Our audience wants to know how and why you know Yiddish as a third generation survivor. Where does your Yiddish come from?
Yiddish. Where does my Yiddish come from? This is a good question. So first of all, my grandmother really raised me growing up. She spoke to me only in Yiddish. So Yiddish was my first language. So I was primed to speak Yiddish. It was always, my brain is wired to speak Yiddish. Es ist gewesen mein ersten Sprach. And moreover, though, I went to a Jewish day school in Montreal that taught Yiddish. In fact, doing this project, I began to understand that the school I went to was really rooted in the same cultural Jewish values that came out of Poland. They never really told us that growing up. I didn't know where my school's philosophy came from, but it was a secular cultural Jewish school that taught Yiddish, and we learned language and literature. That was the focus of our education. So in some ways too, I felt like I really understood these women because I had a similar education to them.
Amazing. I know that the research effort for this book took you all over the world. It began, as you mentioned earlier in our talk, in London. I know you went to Poland 2 times. You did some of your research on the Hebrew University's campus. Where do the documents that are footnoted in the 70 pages of your book, where did most of the research come from?
Well, after the 70 pages of footnotes, there's like a 30-page bibliography. That's why the book's so long. It's all sources. And I go through where a lot of the materials came from. Some of them came from archives. Yes, the Israel National Library was a source at Hebrew University for sure. Some amazing rare books and books from the 40s, and Renya left a testimony there, handwritten, that I came across that told some stories that she hadn't told in some of her other testimonies. Some of the original books from the Yiddish book, as I mentioned, took snippets from other publications, and those were publications. Where would I find that? What were they even? They were all at the Israel National Library. So some of the amazing books, all published in the 40s, right after the war, even some towards the tail end of the war. 100, 200, 300-page books of obituaries of Jews who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto and other resistances. Really amazing sources. I found similar sources to that in Poland. Polin Museum, there's a Jewish Veteran Association that published similar obituary documents. Jewish Historical Institute in Poland, and numerous archives in Israel. I got a lot of information from the Ghetto Fighters House, from Moreshet, Masua, and the museum in DC, YIVO, the Center for Jewish History. I was all over the place. London, there were, the Jewish Public Library in Montreal. I'm trying to think. It's all in the book at the end. I know a lot of people reach out to me because they want to do research on their own families, and they're asking me where they can find these kind of documents, but email me and I'll help you.
Last question from the audience. What has been or have been some of the most surprising or emotional or impactful reactions to your book so far?
I mean, it's been overwhelming for me. This project went public with an article I wrote for the New York Times about a month ago, and the response has been like nonstop since then. I'm reading everything that comes in, even if I haven't replied to you yet. And I think some of the most emotional reactions are when I hear from family members, as I said, or so many people have been writing to me saying, oh, my grandmother was also in the Warsaw Ghetto Underground. I know she worked in the hospital. I know she helped Jews. She never talked about it. Please help me. Have you ever heard of her? Do you have any information? So I found out about so many other women who are not even in the book, who I didn't even know about before, even since the book became public a few weeks ago.
Judy, I want to just thank you again and encourage everyone to buy The Light of Days. It's essential reading. There's also a young readers edition for school age audience, and a link to Judy's book, I think, should be found in the chat. Judy, thank you for your time and for sharing this extraordinary story with us. We're very grateful.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Judy and Diane, I want to thank you so much for this engaging conversation, and I want to thank everyone for participating and supporting us tonight. If you'd like to learn more information about the Hebrew University, please contact me directly. We did just post Judy's website in the chat, so you can also contact her and purchase her book. And we thank you so much for joining us this evening, and have a good night.